everything comes to the floor in such a hyper-partisan manner?
I would argue that it's already in the Constitution.
We've overtaxed people.
People like to legislate by emotion.
It's important to address when the governor oversteps his boundaries.
I'll pull up my pocket version here.
1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best source for political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, a former state representative from southern Minnesota. And with me today is former Representative Tim Miller and Stan Tvedt and Steve Porter, both deer farmers from northern Minnesota. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show. I want to talk about a really important topic today. It is about deer farming. It also impacts broadly agriculture because it addresses the government's overreach on farming. And we've heard a lot about chronic wasting disease in recent years and the government's response to it, and how it is an overreach into farming because the DNR at a high level really can't control the wild deer population. So they're going after the only thing they can control, which is the small number of people that are farming deer. But this also has implications for property rights. And if you grow hogs or turkeys or any other livestock, I'd like you to pay attention because what the DNR and the government is doing on this issue could apply to your livestock soon. So, Steve, I'd like to introduce you first. Steve Tvedt, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your history?
Stan Tvedt.
Stan Tvedt, sorry. Stan Tvedt. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into deer farming.
Well, I had a dairy farm for 15 years of marriage, and then we kind of lost that due to some stray voltage that has caused us to lose our dairy animals. Then we went into alternative, doing many different things. I'm kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. And if I get emotional today, I'm sorry, but
So Stan,
I really put everything into alternative farming, as which I'm doing now. And I'm at the point where if we don't get this thing settled, we may lose everything.
So Stan,
yep, go ahead.
That's just, and you might lose everything, and it's at the hands of what? The state of Minnesota,
Government.
So how many deer farmers are there in Minnesota?
When I started, there was 370 or 80, I believe, and we are currently down to about 79.
Wow! And
That's how many have left the industry in 10 years?
Yeah. How long have you been doing it then?
About 10 years. This is the start of my 11th year. Okay.
So you were there when it really was at its good days.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And I probably would have never started this if I would have known I would have had to fight my government to be in a legal business.
Yeah. And we'll get into that. Definitely. And so Steve, you farm deers as well. You have a little bit, tell us about how you have kind of two different angles to this. You're a deer farmer, and then what is your background in law enforcement also?
In 1990, I got into law enforcement. I was a young deputy. In 1992, I had hunting land. I talked to a game warden. I just wanted to see a big deer. I was discouraged. There weren't any big deer, and I bought a pet deer, and I had a fence, and it was just a hobby. And I stayed in law enforcement. I got 29 and a half years in. I'm happily retired. I was a deputy, a chief deputy, a sheriff. I understand criminal law and constitution. I understand it very well. I've spent countless hours on the witness stand testifying in court to send bad guys to prison. So when I saw this assault coming on our industry, I recognized it right away as being unconstitutional. I've been raising deer since 1992. My farm is 32 years old. And so when this assault started coming from Rick Hansen in the Democrat Party, Jamie Becker Finn, Bob Meyer with the Minnesota DNR, they all collaborated, but they had a rat at the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association. They were able to squeeze Craig Ingwall, a former attorney for the DNR, in to be the executive director of the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association. It was their own lobbying tool. The DNR hijacked the club. And then they started formulating laws against us to squeeze us out of business. I went into our county attorney that I'd worked with for years, and I said, I need the name of a good attorney that has successfully sued the state of Minnesota, not in state court, but in federal court. Can you please give me the name of who we can win on constitutional violations? He did some research, billed me for half an hour. He turned around from his computer and he said, the name of the attorney that you want is Eric Cardahl.
Yep, we know him well.
Yep.
We
Yeah,
we hired Eric Cardahl, and I'll tell you something about Eric. He doesn't gamble, and he doesn't take losing cases. He doesn't have time for losing cases. He takes winning cases. And so we are moving forward in a federal lawsuit against the state of Minnesota.
So let's unpack. So we have deer farming, and I don't want to be insulting of people listening to this. They are literally, think of any other livestock. They're all done a little bit differently. But think of a livestock farm, and in your case, it's deer is what you have as livestock. And it's an industry, it's a legitimate business. Tell us for a moment just kind of what the DNR started doing. So get into a little bit chronic wasting disease and what that is, because a lot of people listening won't actually they might have heard of it, but they don't know. There's chronic wasting disease. The DNR comes in, they started getting their hands into farming, kind of unpack the journey that brought us to, kind of where we are at this lawsuit today.
Yep. So let me give you the foundation first of all, okay? Deer farming in Minnesota is in fact an agricultural pursuit. If you look up Minnesota Statute 17.452, it will tell you that cervidae deer are livestock. And so for the rest of this conversation, we don't have to use the word deer. We can say cows, and people will have it simple. They're my livestock, according to state statute. Okay, so then I'm in a USDA program, United States Department of Agriculture, and I have to have 5 years of monitoring and collecting brain samples, tissue, lymph nodes, skin tabs, everything, and an inventory. I have to reconcile my inventory and follow USDA federal guidelines before I can really conduct any business or cross a state line. I have to have 5 years of surveillance. And then the USDA says, Steve, you have a healthy herd. We're going to allow you to ship across a state line. Okay, so now I've met that. Now, if I ever bought a deer from another farmer, and let's say I have 15 years of surveillance, and that guy has 2, I lower my standard from 15 years of CWD surveillance down to 2, and I'm not able to conduct business. The USDA program is fine. I don't have CWD. So as we go forward, Stan and I get to stand on a foundation of we don't have a disease. If one brainstem came back positive for CWD, we'd be shut down. They'd come in, give us indemnification through USDA. They'd buy all our animals and kill us off, similar to a turkey farm with avian bird flu.
Give about it like a 30-second definition for people that don't know exactly what CWD is.
So CWD is called chronic wasting disease. It was discovered out west in a research facility. However, they say it's always fatal. It's always fatal. Kind of like COVID, okay? Very similar. But Wind Cave National Park was diagnosed with CWD in their elk under high fence in South Dakota, and they've had CWD for 20 years, and all the hype will tell you it's always fatal. It's going to devastate your animals. It's going to kill off the herd. You're not going to be able to hunt. This is a bad disease. We got to get under control. Wind Cave National Park's had it for 20 years in their elk. Google it. They just had to kill off 50 or 60 animals because the animals are outgrowing their population capacity in the park. They've had CWD for 20 years. To limit the spread of CWD in the park, they got to go out and slaughter 60 animals to keep the population under control. Sounds not very devastating.
So chronic wasting disease is a disease of the brain. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a misfolded prion.
And does it, if you eat deer that's infected with chronic wasting disease, do you die?
Nobody has ever had it transferring from deer to people. There's not one example, but in CWD, if you look at it under a microscope, from what I hear, you cannot tell the difference from CWD to scrapie in sheep. I think it's just scrapie, but they called it chronic wasting disease. because then there's a lot of dollars that are going to come forward to fund this thing and research it. And it's chronic, and we're going to lose our deer herd.
Now, Tim and I both served on the ag committees in the Minnesota House, and I remember discussing chronic wasting disease when a Democrat, Aaron May Quaid, said, well, why don't we just go around and test all the deer in farms? And it's my understanding you can't test a deer until they're dead, right? Because you're taking a sample of their brain to test. So the point being, when you were talking about many years of monitoring, anytime a deer dies or a deer is butchered, you take a sample of that deer, and therefore your herd and all the offspring, you've tracked it for years, and so that you know that you're not passing down any traits of CWD within your herd. That's the point of it. So I just wanted to let everybody kind of understand what the disease is, how you can test for it, and you only test for it post-mortem. And of course, there's signs and stuff if deer are stumbling, or you can sometimes see an infected deer based on their behaviors, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So understand, deer are in close quarters. They socially groom, they breed, they interact, they lick, they groom. It's spread from deer to deer. And so my deer under observation, the USDA science is, if I had CWD somewhere in a 5-year period when they're in close quarters and I'm sending in brain stems annually and I never have a positive, there's scientific results there that say he doesn't have CWD. It spreads like wildfire, they claim. I don't have it.
And then wild deer don't mingle with your deer because you have fencing. How tall are your fences around your deer?
I have 8-foot fence, and part of the lawsuit is that the Democrats, Rick Hansen and Jamie Becker Finn and all these, they passed a law that said we have to put up exclusionary fence, and that would limit, they claim, the spread of CWD. But they somehow switched the conversation from Steve doesn't have CWD to what if he has CWD. And we want a double fence. Steve, wink, wink, nod, nod. You can stay in deer farming. You can't make any money with Walsh's signature. We've made no more deer farm licenses available. All your animals are worthless to sell off the farm. It's a regulatory taking. But if you want to stay in business, we want you to. You just got to put up a $200,000 fence, and then you can stay in business, because we want to stop the spread of disease if you possibly ever get it. But under the Constitution, we have equal protection under the law. And there's no example of a TB outbreak in Skyme with cattle where the DNR came in and said, we want to manage livestock like we do deer, and we want all the cattle farms that could get the disease of TB to double fence. And we haven't done it with turkeys.
And that's an important thing for people to understand. Jeremy and I saw this in many different industries. The one way that Minnesota, if they don't want you doing something, they make it, they put rules on you that make it so expensive and so time consuming to do it that people just kind of throw up their arms and say, forget it, I can't do this anymore. And they're like, so that we have heard that before. And I heard it in deer as well. We want you to have a vibrant business, but don't you care about, the rest of the state of Minnesota? Just do these simple things for us, and then everyone's going to be happy. And it's just untenable. It's unrelatable. There's not only the double fencing, there was all sorts of other things. I don't know, since I've been out for 2 years, so I don't know what they ended up passing the last 2 years. I know what they were trying to pass when I was in office. And there was like a dozen criteria of things that you would have to do, including, like you said, and you might want to clarify that about the ability to transport deer and how they've restricted that right now. But they've made it basically untenable to be able to do this industry. Correct?
So we got a lawsuit going. We had our first hearing in Fergus Falls in front of a federal judge, John Tunheim. In that first hearing, the judge asked the state attorney, Pulitzer, I think his name was, the attorney general for the state. He said, it appears to me that the state of Minnesota is trying to legislate away deer farms. And the attorney said, I wouldn't argue against that. I believe that to be true. Well, that's called a regulatory taking. So the state of Minnesota could have said, we're going to repeal the law 17.452 that says deer are livestock, and we're going to classify them as wild animals and you can't have them. But they didn't repeal that law because they would have to give us due process and pay us for what they're taking. But what they did instead is they've passed all sorts of laws where we limit our income increase our expenses, and chase us out of business. The judge asked the question of the state attorney. He said, yes, they're trying to legislate this industry out of business. It's called a regulatory taking.
Can you guys explain what it is a deer farmer does? You raise your deer. Do you sell hunts so people can come in and hunt a deer and take that deer for processing? Do you process the animals on site? Do you just sell your deer to butcher shops, or what's the product that you guys offer?
So for me, I have a doe urine collection facility, and I sell thousands of gallons all across the country. So if I had a diseased herd, I wouldn't be selling doe urine, but they want me to put up a double fence, wink, wink, nod, nod, for $200,000, but you can keep selling doe urine for people to pour in scrapes. If I had disease, how are we controlling it? But again, I don't have disease. So I sell doe urine. I used to sell breed stock. We had 700 deer farms at one time. Then the assault started. And as soon as Walt signed and says there will be no more deer farm licenses, all my breed stock became worthless. So he devalued everything. I do sell hunts, and I had an entertainment business where I would take live trophy bucks to sports shows from Little Rock, Arkansas to Green Bay to Bismarck, Twin Cities. I had a thriving entertainment business, and Bob Meyer, the commissioner of the DNR, also destroyed that business. It was very clever what he did. He had to lie, but he got it done.
Stan, what do you do with your deer?
I'm a hunting preserve. I raise all of my own deer and have my own preserve here on the farm.
Okay. Yeah, there's a deer, a reindeer farmer just up the road from me here, down in Lake Crystal, and she used to bring deer to events all Christmas long, and to ship deer all over the country. And I think she suffered from the same issue that you did, where they prohibit you from moving the deer about the state. So, okay. So I just wanted to let people know, what it is a deer farmer does and what your products are. And for those of you that that you allow hunts, do people come in and just kill the deer and take it and process it themselves, or do you process it, or does it go from your place to a butcher shop?
We take the deer. People do come in and hunt, and people harvest the deer, and they take the deer home to process themselves or to a butcher stop. Of course, I have to collect the brainstem, the lymph nodes, and do testing to make sure that deer is healthy. We test every deer that leaves the property.
Well, and one of the frustrating things for me when I was in the Ag Committee, I actually made an amendment to a bill to show the absurdity. So Rick Hansen came forward with or Jamie Becker Finn, one of the two of them came forward with all these regulations to place on deer farms. And we constantly have this conversation about those deer as they exist now are highly tested behind fences, but we have all these wild deer everywhere. So my amendment, everything that they were going to put on regulations of a second fence and some of these other things, I placed on wild deer as well. And it was meant to be sarcastic and make a point because, of course, I said, well, that's ridiculous. We can't control the wild deer herds. That's the point right there that's very frustrating about this. Do you want to kind of explain or contrast what because we're not only dealing with what happens to farmed animals, but it's because it's deer. We have lots of wild ones in Minnesota. So kind of talk about how those two relate to each other.
So yes, and let me back up just a second beyond that question. So I said earlier that scrapie is in sheep and CWD in deer, and you can't tell them apart. Oklahoma, I spoke to a representative from Oklahoma named Scott Tvedt, and he passed a law in Oklahoma that if you have deer in a USDA program like Stan and I, and you're breeding for CWD resistance, which is having incredible results with an SS marker at the 96th codon, selective breeding, which bred scrapie out of sheep, is being done in deer. He passed a law in Oklahoma that deer farm deer can be turned loose to build up genetic resistance in the wild. In Minnesota, Bob Meyer, Jamie Becker Finn, they passed laws for me when I have a lot of SS animals that I've been breeding for on my own dime. SS animals at the 96th codon. These are premium animals, and they want me to double fence, And if I don't double fence, take my license. And then it says in the statute 35.155 subdivision 4, the last sentence, the DNR commissioner, if you don't follow every rule perfectly well, may come out and kill your deer. So we're at the stage now where they're gearing up to take our license and then come and kill our deer. There's no other livestock industry where they've said the DNR can come on your property and kill your healthy animals.
I hope to touch on that later because in my opinion, my experience at the house has been that that's the direction they're going. They're going after deer today because that's a small industry, but they're going after more. Now,
I just want to clarify a point. So this deer from Oklahoma that the sheep that they bred are resistant to this disease, and so you are breeding deer that are likely also resistant to the same to chronic wasting disease.
Yes. And I'll tell you real quick, there's a farmer in Wisconsin called Greg Fleece. Greg Fleece is in a pandemic area for CWD. It's all over. About 10 years ago, maybe, he showed up with CWD in his hunting preserve, but it's outside the fence first. It's all over. The state said to him, you can keep raising deer. You can't sell live animals off your property, but we'll let you keep your business because it's everywhere. And you must hunt your animals and kill them, but keep sending in the brain stems. Let us know the results. He had an over 50% prevalence rate of CWD in his preserve. He tested them with a Dr. Seabury, the genetic markers, and he found out that most of his deer were a GG marker, which is similar. That's what we find in the wild, a GG marker at codon 96. And so then he started switching up his breeding program through artificial insemination, breeding to SS and HH deer primarily. And he winds up the last 2 years, all of his deer in his preserve commingle, touch nose, breed, eat out of the same feeders, drink out of the same ponds, socially groom, high levels of contact. He went from 50% prevalence rate to 0 2 years in a row. But he has SS, HH, and HS markers. Oklahoma sees the research. They want to get ahead of the curve. They pass a law to turn these animals loose in Oklahoma. Minnesota says we have to kill all the wild deer. If it shows up, we got to go in and cull all the wild deer, and we're going to take the deer away from the hunters and limit and slow the spread. Not one state has ever slowed the spread of CWD through intensive culling efforts. It has not happened. There's no science to support it. And Minnesota says, we're going to slow the spread and kill your deer off. In fact, the DNR is offering a free lifetime license to landowners to hunt deer if they allow them to come on there and cull and kill their deer through CWD protocols. To come in there and just start butchering and killing everything. You get a free license to hunt deer. You might not have any deer to hunt, but for the rest of your life, you're going to have a free tag.
So if we could change these gears, because this has implications not only for the threat to your industry, and I don't want to diminish that because that is huge, but as we discussed beforehand and we touched on in the beginning of this, there's some property rights issues. If I understood right, Stan, you've had some incidences with the DNR coming onto your property, right?
Yeah, well, they've made a law that it says that the law officer of a DNR is coming to my farm to do the farm inspections.
And what happened there?
Which would come against our constitutional rights.
Right. In what way? So tell me what they did. The DNR comes to you.
Constitutional right. They should. If they would come with a biologist onto our farms, we wouldn't have an issue. But when they come with a law officer with the ability to arrest, then that changes the whole perspective of our inspections.
So the DNR, for example, comes with a sheriff's deputy onto your property and say, we're going to inspect things. We're going to tell you what you're going to do. What happened?
The law officer of the DNR come to do the inspections.
DNR, what are they called?
Conservation officer.
Conservation officer.
Just so people watching this know, I was just flabbergasted because I saw this go through. Conservation officers are not only armed, they now are empowered to arrest and to take people in their vehicles off to jail. They are empowered to do that, folks. This is not the sheriff's deputy. This is not police departments. This is conservation officers that have the ability to arrest people on the spot in Minnesota.
Right. So,
And
so
what
let me,
happens to some of us farms, or well, to us or to myself, is I'm not subject to just allowing them to go out and do their inspection and be done. No, I have to stay present. And then it gives them the right to just go waltzing into my offices and do their search or whatever. If they want to do paperwork or whatever it would be, they have the right to just go waltzing right in without a search warrant. Or I mean, I don't have nothing to hide, but I also don't want my constitutional rights to be violated.
Yep. So, Steve, you've been in law enforcement, so explain to the people where the lines are crossed with what he just described.
so good job, Stan. So if you're talking to a law enforcement officer, I'm going to quiz you guys, okay? Jeremy and Tim, do you guys have the right to remain silent, and when do you have the right to remain silent? Could you guys tell me that as former state representatives?
At all times.
Sometimes,
At
yeah.
all times.
Oh, but a
have the
farmer
right to,
doesn't.
you have the right to remain silent if you're not arrested and after you're arrested in custody. So you always have the right to remain silent. And the Constitution says no state can compel any of its citizens to testify against themselves. So if the game warden threatens you or coerces you or bribes you or threatens, he can't do that. So what the state of Minnesota did is they said, you guys, we're taking you away from the Board of Animal Health, even though you're livestock, we're turning you over to an enforcement agency. We're sending licensed cops onto your property with body cameras rolling, and they're going to do the inspection. And you have to talk to the cop. But if you don't talk to the cop and you tell him to leave, we're going to take your license to farm away. So remember I said the state can't compel you to testify, but it sounds kind of compelling when they say, we're going to take your license to farm away unless you don't let a cop on your property to film everything and answer all your questions. So the first time a game warden showed up on my property, I asked him very specifically, because I know criminal law better than they do, 100 times. And I said, are you here today as a criminal investigator or is it a civil capacity? He said, we do civil enforcement. This is civil. And I said, I noticed that you have a bulletproof vest and a gun and a taser and a body camera. Is your body camera rolling when you come onto my private property? Yes, it is. It's our policy. We must record everything. And then I got him. I said, does the Plainview Doctrine apply today when you come on my property? And he starts explaining to me what the Plainview Doctrine is. And I said, I don't need you to explain it. I asked if it applies today when you come on the property, because the Plainview Doctrine is a criminal word. It's a criminal thing, okay? He said he's civil. He says, yes, it does apply. What is the Plainview Doctrine? If he comes on my property as a law enforcement officer, anything seen in plain view while he's there is subject to prosecution, okay? But he's got a license, which is civil, that he can come onto my property and inspect my farm license, and then he can record everything. I said, so if you've seen something that was illegal, which I don't have, but maybe I had an illegal burning barrel, or maybe I had expired tabs on a trailer or ATV. He said, yes, I could write you a ticket for that. But I don't want you on my property. You're telling me you're civil, but you're bringing enforcement tools with you. Leave the enforcement tools at the end of the driveway. So Stan alluded to, he said, if they sent a DNR biologist onto my property, we don't have a leg to stand on because we have a license, and our license is subject to terms and conditions. But people in your audience will say, well, you got a license, so you agreed to the terms and conditions. Not so. If you have a license to run a restaurant, you have a health inspector come in, but he doesn't have powers of arrest. And so if I want to go into a restaurant and search for methamphetamine as a cop, guess what I need to get? A search warrant. I can't say you have a license to have a restaurant, I get to come in. If you have a daycare license and I want to go into a daycare and search, guess what I need to do? I need to get consent or a search warrant. You can't go in there without.
Well, and here's the change so that people understand. When I was in office, you mentioned the Board of Animal Health, and the Board of Animal Health is tasked with among other things, but primarily when it relates to diseases in farmed animals. Okay. And the Board of Animal Health had authority under the deer, and they were trying to take that away and put it under the DNR's empowerment. And what you're describing to me is the DNR has that control now. Is that correct?
Yes.
They passed it into state law that says that deer farms will be inspected by a licensed peace officer from the DNR with powers of arrest.
It used to be the Board of Animal Health would come in and check this permitting.
They would come in and check the permitting, and I signed up for it. I got a license. I got to allow an inspection. I have nothing to complain about. But when it's a law enforcement officer, what if it's a law enforcement officer with a body cam rolling, and I got a toddler running around my yard and their diaper falls off? That means I'm going to have a video of my little girl with a bare bottom running across the yard on a game warden's camera for him to take back and review. What are we doing?
And understand that these DNR, what do we call them again? I hate them, so I always forget their name. The DNR.
Conservation officers.
Conservation officers. As I said before, they have been given full authority. When we were dealing with the post George Floyd situation at the Capitol, where they fenced off the Capitol, they had so many state troopers, they had so much Capitol Police, and they still, in their minds, needed help. And in some ways, they probably did. The conservation officers were actually there in full garb because they are considered by the state of Minnesota. They are peace officers. And by the way, so the state troopers answer to, I forgot where they answer to, but in any case, I'm going to get to my point rather than try and figure out. But you know who the conservation officers answer to directly? Governor. This is the governor's police force, is what it is. And I will tell you, at the Capitol, I had conversations with them, not real pleasant ones, because they acted like they ruled the roost. And I'm like, you don't even belong here. Yes, we have full authority to be here as per the governor's orders. And so they're taking that sort of attitude on you. I'm trying to really accentuate and make sure people understand that these conservation officers are coming in with the full authority as you would see any other police officer, any other sheriff's deputy, anything like that. They're coming in with that full power. They can arrest you and they can take you away.
Correct. And I sent you video links that you could splice in at this time. I had the game wardens on my farm, and I had my sheriff come to watch and observe the illegal constitutional behavior by the wardens. I had the sheriff and the chief deputy here, and Stan had his sheriff, Mitch Bernstein, present. Mitch Bernstein went on the record and said what they're doing is unconstitutional. It's wrong. I'm worried if they do it with deer farmers, which are low-hanging fruit, they will be doing it to pig farmers, turkey farmers, cattle farmers.
And that's my point. Yep.
Right. They're going to be doing it. We're low-hanging fruit. We don't have a lot of money. We're a small industry. They can attack us and run us out of business. And so the state patrol answer to the governor, and so do the game wardens. But when we have a far left governor like Tim Walz, we may have game wardens that are patriots, but they're easily weaponized to go against agriculture, to go against whatever they want. And so once they're weaponized, they got to kind of follow orders or they get in trouble. When the game warden was on my property, I said, why don't you stand up for the oath that you took and resign today before you violate my constitutional rights? I'm not resigning today. And I said, are your body cameras rolling? Yes, they are. And I said, okay, well, I want you to shut them off. We're not shutting them off. And at one point in the video, if you show it, I got heated. And the one warden went with the sheriff around my fence line to inspect my livestock fence. And the other warden stood in the yard. And Stan. And I stood in the yard and I said, are you still filming? And he's taking his body and he's moving left, moving right. And he's filming everything, turning around, filming my whole entire yard, which is not part of his inspection process. And I come up to him and I stood in front of him to block his camera. He'd moved to film over here, get my plate numbers. I stepped in front of him. It looked like I was stalking him. And I said, you can shut your camera off. And at some point I said, you get back in your car right now. Go get in your car. This is not part of your job to stand here and film all my stuff. I was a retired cop. That came out of me. And I turned to him and I said, go now.
By the way, you can access those body cams.
Yeah, and I do, and I had people filming as well, and I did data requests, and I got all of them. But I said, hey, here's the deal: you're going to go get in your car, or I'm going to grab you by the arm and escort you. He said, I'm fine right here. I said, I'm going to grab you in about 5 seconds and I'm escorting you to your car. And I would have been charged with assault as soon as I touched him. I wouldn't have grabbed him. I was bluffing, but the chief deputy was standing right there in my defense. And I would have told him, escort him off the property. 609.65 is criminal trespass. Whoever refuses to leave upon being told to do so is guilty of, without legal claim of right, is guilty of trespass. And so I gave him consent to come on my property because I want to keep my license. But guess what? They're compelling me to testify to a cop in violation of the Constitution.
So their main goal should be for inspection to make sure that you have your fence intact and to check. I think there's ear tags that are required, and they have to be certain size lettering visible for so many yards. And so they make sure that they all have, ear tags. I don't know if they check dung piles or something, but tell us about Steve Green's bill, Senator Steve Green's bill. Or is that's where you went down to the Capitol to testify? What does his bill do? And just kind of walk us through that.
Senate File 956. I went down there with Stan last week, and that bill, Senator Steve Green's getting a lot of complaints. The DNR, please understand, has no credibility in rural Minnesota. People have lost faith in them. They think they're dishonest and they're not trustworthy, and they violate the Constitution. People all across northern Minnesota have no faith in the DNR. The once honorable position with a shiny integrity badge, it's tarnished. And Steve's hearing the complaints. So Steve puts forward a bill that says, basically in a nutshell, hey, could we get the Constitution, the game wardens to follow the Constitution? Well, the Constitution already exists. What do you mean to get them to follow it? But there's no course of action if your constitutional rights are violated. People say, well, if you violate my rights, I can sue them. But there's not a damages claim there. So what do I mean? If a game warden exceeds his authority in a search and he grabs a bunch of evidence, he barges into your fish house and you didn't let him in. Okay? In the state of Minnesota versus Krenz, it says stop barging in, you can't. Krenz, Krenz. You can't barge in. So they're mandated not to barge in anymore. But if they do barge in and somebody had a line of cocaine on a mirror in a fish house and they seized it, but it was an illegal search and seizure, it's deemed as a fruit of the poisonous tree. You can't bring it into court. But the game warden seizes the cocaine, he does everything, but it was an illegal search. He goes to court, the guy gets an attorney, and the judge says, illegal search, evidence is not admissible, fruit of the poisonous tree, case dismissed. But the guy has to pay $10,000 on an attorney. So he says, I won, I don't have an attorney bill. Well, I'm not for anybody using cocaine. I'm not for that. But I am for the Constitution. I'm for it and our rights because our forefathers died to give us these rights. So I'm for the Constitution. Why? Because if you're in a fish house and your wife is peeing in a bucket, I don't think a game warden should barge in. You have a reasonable expectation of privacy as described in State versus Krenz. So now we got game wardens violating the law, and Steve Green says, hey, can we get you to comply with the Constitution? And the colonel for the DNR, Rodham Smith, comes up and testifies, and he says, this bill is an anti-law enforcement bill, and if you pass this bill, it's going to endanger officers, it's going to endanger civilians, it's going to put animals at risk. This is a bad bill. Now remember, what's the bill asking? Could you guys follow
the Constitution?
That's all it's for.
That's all he's asking. And get a search warrant when required and seize evidence according to the standards set forth in criminal procedure rules. But they're not doing that. So the colonel then says, if this law passes into law, I won't even be able to have my conservation officers, if someone's in handcuffs, they won't be able to do a pat down for weapons. And I testified and I said, it's clearly evident that this colonel of the DNR has no knowledge of criminal law, none whatsoever. We're talking about the Constitution. And here's my trivia question for everybody watching. Does the constitutional protection from illegal search and seizure follow you into handcuffs, into custody, into the back seat of a squad car? No. You have a right to say, you're not searching my car, you're not searching my house, you need consent or a search warrant. But as soon as you're under arrest in handcuffs, the officer's going to pat you down. It's search subsequent to arrest. So here Steve Green's trying to say, follow the Constitution, and the colonel of the DNR drags him into murky water and says, we can't even pat down somebody we've arrested. Well, the Constitution, we don't get a search warrant to put someone in orange coveralls and take them out of their jeans.
Well, and for people watching that, understand the story through deers, but you may not have an affinity for deer farming or something like that. What Steve is talking about right now, Jeremy and I have seen in a bunch of different bills that have come forward, because law enforcement, and I understand they have a very difficult situation. I'm very supportive of law enforcement. They're trying to pit us against them when they do this, but obviously, whenever you get into the line where you cross the line on infringing on someone's constitutional rights, it does make law enforcement's job more difficult. So what you see is you see bills that come through that kind of shave away at that. They kind of say, well, this isn't really an infringement of constitutional right. This is just a police officer trying to do their job, right?
Right.
But fortunately, the courts have consistently said, even to the error of where maybe there was a reasonable action by a police officer, but the judge says they're going to err on the side of the individual and the individual's rights, because that's one of the fundamentals of being an American citizen is that we have certain individual rights. And when in doubt, we are going to defer to that. That's why the Miranda reading came in, the Miranda rights reading that you hear on, all these cop shows and stuff like that, because it's so redundant now, everyone's heard it. But if someone doesn't realize that they don't have to speak, or if they do speak, it can be held against them at any time. And one of the little nuances is that any time if you started talking and decide to stop, that's okay too.
Right.
You have to tell people that, or it can be thrown out of court because we err so far on the side of this is an individual. If they want to talk and get loose tongue, that's on them, right?
Right.
But
It's spontaneous utterance.
Right, but they don't have to talk. And it's incumbent upon the professionals to know those lines better than the average person, because they're the ones that have the power and authority in the situation. And you have a scared person, may or may not know. I'm not saying errors can't happen, but that has to happen. So in the case of when you hear the colonel talking about something like that, he's trying to appeal to someone's sensibilities, not the law.
Yep. I would just kind of dive into the bill a little bit more. So this is Senate File 956, right?
Yeah.
That's Steve Green. So at a high level, this bill requires search warrants by conservation officers before they, search and take property. This also applies to when they take your ATV or snowmobile and other things, your ice house. They can currently take your ice house without a warrant. And this search warrant and proper authority to seize property is included in this bill across a lot of different aspects, and isn't just coming on your property and unlawfully searching and potentially seizing property.
Correct. So if you look at that and play devil's advocate, what problems do you have with that bill?
Well, I mean, following the Constitution, it's obviously one of the most important things to me. In the legislature, I tried to also prohibit civil asset forfeiture, where as a law enforcement officer, you pull somebody over that's visibly drunk driving, you can confiscate their car, even though they are later found innocent or not guilty. They have still given up their car. Their car's been taken. There's a lot of the law enforcement agencies across the state take property, even though someone is not guilty of a crime. And this is basically the conservation officers doing the same thing. They're not following the Constitution when they're seizing someone's property. So I think it's a good bill. So tell me, you came down to testify. You had people testifying against it, saying, "Look, this is a tool that we need in law enforcement, and you're taking away. This is an anti-cop bill." Was the bill laid over for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill, or was there a vote taken on it in committee that day?
Yeah. So interesting thing. Let me just say this: they had opposition to the bill, and so the DNR reached out to the Minnesota Sheriff's Association, and they had a letter that said all 87 sheriffs in the state of Minnesota are opposed to this bill. So Steve gets up there and says, "Well, I have a letter here from Sheriff Mitch Bernstein, and he's in favor of the bill." But the Sheriff's Association sent a letter that all 87 sheriffs, I don't think they quizzed them, but they put that forward in opposition to the bill. And then Steve said, and I've spoke to numerous sheriffs who are in favor of this bill. So I'm so discouraged that that the Sheriff's Association that I was once so proud of would submit a letter and blanket all 87 are opposed. What? They didn't reach out to Steve Green and find out what the problem is? I'm not hearing complaints of deputies refusing to leave, but I am hearing complaints of game wardens. So the bill was laid over, it didn't die. And so today I've been talking to Steve Green, and he drew this bill up long before I ever talked to him. And I wasn't pushing for it. The bill's laid over, and they're going to look at changing a couple things and trying to move it along. But Steve also has a bill over that I did suggest. I wasn't the first to hear it, but I've been pushing it for years, okay? Many years ago, Scott Jensen ran for sheriff or for governor, and I had a fundraiser for Scott, and I had about 25 farmers in the room from every walk of life: dairy, beef, pigs, turkeys. It wasn't deer farmers. And Scott comes in the room before the fundraiser. We're going to meet with him for an hour roundtable. He said, "When do you want me to talk?" And I said, "Scott, you're not talking. You're listening. Get your notebook out." Okay. And the farmers went around the room one by one, every act of agriculture, and just lit into who? The Minnesota DNR for what they're doing. The Minnesota DNR are collecting fees and shutting off irrigation pumps so people can't irrigate their corn. And if you don't do everything right, you can't turn water on to your corn. They're cutting down your irrigation rights. Their mafia attitude of we created a new map, the Minnesota DNR, of your farmland, and our new map that didn't go through legislation shows 15 acres of wetland that was never there before. Well, I've farmed it for 30 years. Yeah, you owe us $5,500 an acre for that 15 acres of land, but it grows good corn. Yeah, no, you got to buy land over in the bog for $5,500 an acre to offset it, and then we'll let you farm it. Well, I can't afford $5,500 an acre for 15 acres. Well, we'll mitigate it down to 2. Well, wait a minute. That's extortion. If it's science and it's 15 acres and you made the map, how can somebody just decide in your agency, no, it's no longer 15, it's 2. Write a check for 12 grand and we're good to go. That's extortion. They went around the room, you guys. Farmers are upset. And I see Tom Peterson, our agriculture commissioner, being loyal to Tim Walz, saying that Tim Walz is the hero, the savior of agriculture in Minnesota. Not so. Farmers are upset. They're getting regulated out of business. And so we're low-hanging fruit, the deer farmers. They're coming after us. We have a good attorney. But the rest of you farmers better wake up and figure out what you're doing, and you better figure out how you're going to vote, because Tim Walz is not friend to the agriculture, and these farmers know it. They're aware of it.
Yeah, well, you're talking to two guys that started the Republican Farmer Labor Caucus at the state capitol, because we realized in my first weeks in the legislature that the Democrat Farmer Labor Party doesn't represent farmers
Or
at all.
labor.
or labor. And so it's a constant battle, and I'm glad that you guys are taking this through the courts. For people that grow turkeys, and there's avian flu or bird flu out there, also posing a similar risk. We have the state goes in to slaughter lots of animals, but these wild hogs, the javelina hogs or whatever, that are moving up into northern states. If those hogs come into Minnesota and carry disease, and even though you have a hog barn that's confined, you could suffer the same consequences that you guys are with chronic wasting disease and in wild deer when you're trying to farm deer.
And that was my message. I went to the cattlemen, I went to the pork producers, I went to turkey growers. Those are the ones that I kind of know the best of the different ones. And I said, listen, what's happening to the deer? This was 4 or 5 years ago when I first started getting involved with this deer farming problem 4 years ago. And I said, they're going after deer today. They're coming after you tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so you guys need to get behind this, and it's because those industries are bigger. They're more powerful. Dare I say they have more influence even in the governor's office than you guys do. They're going after, you call it low hanging fruit. They're picking on the little guy. They're picking on the people, they're picking on someone like Stan, okay, who just wants to farm and he does a good job at it. Right, Stan? That's all you want to do is you want to
I wanted to retire and enjoy my farm and my animals. Yep. And I raise them nice, as you can see in the background.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, first they came for the deer farmers, and I did not speak out because I was not a deer farmer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes.
Steve, what did you want to say?
I want to clarify one thing, and you guys are making really good, rock solid point. But for our viewing audience, I want to make this crystal clear, okay? We talked about CWD, and we talked about turkey farmers and killing a lot of animals with avian bird flu. It does go to people. And so when they're diagnosed with avian bird flu, they come in alongside the turkey farmer, they feel bad, and they do indemnification. They get paid for their animals because they're diseased. And they're going to foam them all turkeys in the barn, and they're going to kill them. And then, but they're not killing off the clean, healthy turkey farms. And they're not killing off the clean, healthy dairy farms. They're only killing off the infected farms. So what we're doing in deer farming is we're saying, well, what if you get the disease? We want you to double fence in case you get it. And then we're going to run you out of business, and we're going to admit it in federal court that we're legislating you out of business in case you get the business. Our wild deer industry is so big and so wonderful and so majestic. The wild deer in Minnesota, we can't risk an industry possibly harming them. But I don't have a disease. Well, it doesn't matter. What if? So you guys that are raising other livestocks, yeah, when you get the disease, they're going to pay you and kill your animals. But they're going after clean, healthy farms to run us out. So just buckle up and get ready because they're not done. And I'll just say this. In the far left utopian dream, I believe this to be true. There's a balance in nature between wolves and deer. And there's no room for hunters or private property rights. You guys aren't important. The far left utopian dream, balance out nature. Man's bad.
All right. Well,
it comes down to one real big aspect here. They begin to love creation more than the creator.
that's correct.
So what's next? What is the next step? You talked about a lawsuit. Eric Cardle, you had did you have your first hearing and you lost that one, but you're appealing it, or what's the process? Where does it stand?
Yeah, so Eric Cardle told us when he first took our case, he said, I represent 150 doctors and nurses from Mayo Clinic that refused to take the jab. And he says, I told them, we're most likely going to lose our first hearing. You refused to take the jab and you got fired. They went into their first hearing, and it was a liberal judge appointed by Bill Clinton, and they lost. He said, we got notification, and everybody was down in the mouth and sad. I told them, we're probably going to lose, but then we're going to appeal. And they appeal, and they get it overturned, and they win, and now Mayo Clinic's on the hook for 150 wrongful termination suits. Eric Cardle beat all the power and might of that big hospital down there. Huge deal. So now we go into court, and I'm thinking, the Constitution's alive and well. We're going to win. He said, we're probably going to lose. And we lost. And I was down in the mouth because I thought the Constitution was alive and well. And a liberal judge. Okay, that's what I believe. That's my opinion. And so then now we're heading into appeal, and it'll be a District 8 appeal in front of 3 judges. And we're supposed to be notified of a hearing. We're hoping before June, hoping before July. But guess what happens if we lose there? Guess what we're going to do? We're appealing to the next level because the Constitution means something to me. My forefathers died on a field fighting in a battle to give me constitutional rights, and it's up to me in this generation to fight to preserve my constitutional rights that were given freely to me. Now, I said they were freely given to me, but guess what, you guys? They weren't freely given because there's nobody here to protect my constitutional rights. If they're violated by the far left Democrats in Minnesota, what happens? I have to fundraise and come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars, gather plaintiffs from across the state, and we have to hire Eric Cardahl. So are my constitutional rights free? Not a chance. Because if I don't have a checkbook deep enough to hire an attorney, I don't have constitutional rights.
So where are you at right now with that? Do you have people that are helping? Because we did a lawsuit during COVID. We sued the governor. We sued the governor of Minnesota, and we lost that first round, like you were talking about. We did a GoFundMe for the appellate. That's a whole other story for another video. But GoFundMe went and shut us down.
I raised $40,000 in just a week or two, and then they GoFundMe shut it down because it was, anti-mask or something.
Yeah, it was, even though it was raising money for an appeal to a court.
Yeah,
but you're right; these are very, very expensive. And so, do you have people that are helping you fund this? Do you need people that are helping you fund this?
Of course, we need people to help us fund it, and we're short. And we're still fundraising. We're still trying to do things. I don't have necessarily a GoFundMe, but if people wanted to donate, they could get a hold of me, and we could make a check out to the Minnesota Deer Farmers Association. Now, why would a pig, cattle, turkey farmer want to do that? Because
why would someone in the suburbs want to do that?
Right, because we are going to set a precedent, you guys. And the precedent is either going to be really awesome or awfully nightmarish. That the DNR can seize control of a livestock industry if there's threat of disease. Not disease, threat of disease. And so if we want to stop this in its tracks, we need to win. And we're going to set a precedent, and it's going to be really good or really bad. My phone number is 218-526-0180. People can give me a call. They could look up online porterwhitetail.com, Porter, whitetail.com, and we'd be happy to take any donation to help us with this legal fight, and we're going to set a precedent.
Well, great. Well, thanks to both of you for joining today, so we could learn more about this really important issue, and that we can continue to follow along with your case. I wish Eric Cardahl well. He's a great guy. He's went to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. He's a fantastic constitutional attorney, and you are in great hands. So, Tim, do you have any final words?
Nothing final. Stan or Steve, is there anything you'd like to wrap up with?
I want to say one last thing about Stan Tvedt. Okay, I was in law enforcement for 30 years, and there's a sheepdog that was born into me to protect people that don't have the same mindset or strength or knowledge of the law. I drive into Stan's yard. There's 3 wooden crosses on the right side of his driveway. That's a fact. And I'm not giving up this fight until my good friend Stan Tvedt is made whole. Because there's not a better man.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And thanks to the listeners for tuning in to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.
I'll pull up my pocket version here.
1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.